Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore, and today I've got a couple review units for the latest 8BitDo Pro 2 controllers. Now, as far as functionality, these controllers are exactly the same as the Pro 2 controllers that came out last year. But I think with these two new controller options, it's a good time to revisit this controller all over again. Now, I've mentioned it before, but I'm a big fan of the 8BitDo controllers. I've been using them since their very first controllers almost 10 years ago. And they've got a wide catalog of different controller options, but I've always found that the Pro models, or the Pro 2 like as we're seeing here, are kind of their standard ones. So let's go ahead and take a look in the box. Now, the packaging here is very simple, and it looks like these new controllers are bundled with some thumbstick grips. We'll test these out here later in this video. But before we focus on the controller itself, let's take a look at what else is in the box. We have a USB-C to USB-A cable. This will charge the controller and also hook it up wired. And then finally we have their trademark accordion manual. And these manuals are also available on their website in case you lose the paper copy. Okay, let's have a look at the hardware now. We'll start with the purple model first. Now, the Pro 2 model is kind of like a combination controller. It has elements of the Super Nintendo controller, but then also takes cues from the PlayStation 4 controller as well. But it does have a couple nice added features to it. For example, it has some back buttons that are going to be programmable to whatever button you'd like. Now, I would say this is a pretty intense purple. You really gotta like that color if you want to buy this controller. So let's talk about the actual buttons first. We'll start with the D-pad. Now, to me, this D-pad is a dead ringer for the Super Nintendo controller. It has that rubber membrane connection, and it has a moderate amount of travel and pivot as well. If you want to have that classic controller feel, this is gonna really help. As far as analog sticks go, the design looks a lot like a PS4 analog stick, but actually feels more like an Xbox One. They have an excellent amount of range to them, and they're nice and snappy too. Now let's move on to the face buttons. Now these are reminiscent of the Super Nintendo controller, but all four of these are convex. The buttons themselves are very glossy, especially compared to everything else on this controller. I'd also say these have a moderate amount of travel to them as well, again a lot like the original Super Nintendo controller. They have a very retro feel to them. Speaking of which, the start and select buttons have that same feel too. These are actually rubber buttons like they were on the original controller as well. Now there are a couple other function buttons. For example, we have the star button on the left. This will often work as a screenshot button. And then on the right, we have an 8BitDo button. This will often function as a menu button, especially within like SteamOS or Windows. Finally, in the center here, we have a profile button. So you can set up to 3 different profiles with different button mapping if you'd like. So now let's talk about these shoulder and trigger buttons. And you might have guessed it here, but yes, these are like these Super Nintendo shoulder buttons here. These are easy to press down on and have a rubber membrane connection to them. But one note here is they're easier to press down on the further away you get from the center of the controller. Now the trigger buttons here are very reminiscent of a PS4's controller. They have almost the exact same amount of throw or travel to them, and the small roundedness of the trigger themselves are also reminiscent of those DualShock 4s. Also up top, we have that USB-C port for charging or connection, and then also a pairing button as well. Now this has 4 different connection types. They are labeled as SADX. That is for Switch, Apple, Android, and X input. Also on the back, we have those 2 mappable buttons. These are a little bit clickier than the others, but I love the fact that they don't stick out a bunch and don't get in your way. Another cool feature about the Pro 2 controllers is that they have removable battery packs. And so if you'd like, you could have multiple battery packs and swap them out, or you could actually just use AA batteries right inside, a lot like with an Xbox controller. And the company says you'll get about 20 hours of battery life with the controller, but it's always nice to have that AA option as well. Another thing I like about these controllers is that they have a little bit of a grippy texture to them as well. And it's a very subtle texture here. I think that people may not even notice it. Either way, I love the contrast of the grippiness on the back and the smoothness on the front. As far as transparency goes, this isn't the most transparent of controllers. It's a little bit more subdued or matte. And honestly, I think that's fine, but if I had to choose, I would like them to be a little bit more transparent. As far as ergonomics go, if you prefer the PS4 controller layout, you're going to be right at home right here. Everything is really easy to access, and in my opinion, by having the analog sticks at the bottom here, this is a more D-pad-centric controller. But as an added luxury, those grips do make this nice and comfortable to hold over a long period of use. So yeah, overall, I'd say this is a very comfortable controller. I honestly wasn't a huge fan of the Pro 2 when it first came out, but it's grown on me over the past year or so, especially when it comes to retro gaming. Okay, now let's look at the transparent gray or black model here. Now obviously all the features and functions are going to be exactly the same on this controller, but of course it has a lot less color to it. Really, the only thing that stood out to me between the two controllers here was the glossiness of the buttons on the black controller just seemed to stand out a lot more than they do on the purple one. So yeah, I think between the two controllers, they both look nice and sharp, but if I had to choose to keep only one of the two, I would probably go with the purple one. And I think I've mentioned it before, but I was never really into games during the Nintendo 64 generation. And so I missed out on that whole generation of transparent colored controllers. And so it's kind of cool with this new 8BitDo Pro 2 controller, I do have a little bit of that old history. Now before we get into the software and the testing and everything else, let's talk a little bit about these grip caps. Now both controllers came with the same setup, a green one and a purple one. I think it's a little bit weird that they didn't come with one universal setup, but let's test them out anyway. I'm going to do it on the black controller just because I think they're going to stand out more. To install the caps, all you have to do is just kind of open them up and then slide them over the top of the grip. Now taking a look here, I do like that it adds a little bit of color pop to the controller, and it also gives some height to the sticks as well. The rubber that they use here is very grippy and soft as well. It has a smooth texture that kind of sticks to your thumb. My worry here is that dust and dead skin and residue and stuff like that are going to stick to the cap, and then it's going to get dirty over time. But I guess we'll see how that goes later on in the future. For now, I would say that you probably are going to like these caps if you like to have a smooth texture on your grips, or if you want to add just a little bit of height to the original controller setup. For me, the height does feel really good. It feels a little bit more responsive. But one of my favorite things about the thumbsticks are those rigid edges along the sides. And so personally, between the two, I would rather have the grippiness along the sides of the edges here than to have that little bit of extra height. Either way, it's kind of cool that they're included in the controller so you can test it out yourself. So now let's talk a little bit about setup. Number one is that you're going to want to install the 8BitDo upgrade tool from their website onto your PC or Mac computer. And after you have this installed, all you have to do is just plug in your controller wired, and it's going to tell you whether or not you have the most recent firmware, and then it'll update it as well. As of making this video, the controllers came shipped with 1.08, which is the most recent firmware. But you're probably going to want to check that in the future. Another app that I think is going to be essential is the Ultimate software. You can also get this from their website, and they have Windows, Mac, Google Play, and Apple Store versions. And so to demonstrate, I downloaded the Android version directly from the Google Play Store, and you can see it here. From there, all I had to do was pair the controller via Bluetooth and then open up the app. You'll have a number of different options within here. The first on the left is going to be button mapping. Here you can do things like map those back buttons like we talked about earlier. So for example, if you wanted to map that back right button to the A button for a jump button on the back, that's going to be super handy. Or you could map the L2 so that way you can aim down the sights using a back button as opposed to the left trigger. Now those aren't the only buttons you can map. You can also do all the front buttons as well. One thing in particular is when you map this to Android, the A, B, and XY setup is going to be Nintendo style. So the easiest way to change this to the Xbox layout is just to change the A, B, and XY directly here in the software. Now also within the software, you have some other options available as well. For example, here's where you can create your 3 different profiles depending on your playstyle. Additionally, you can go and change the sensitivity of the analog sticks. For example, if you want them to press at 100% when you get halfway down the stick, you can set that up. Or alternatively, if you want to have a little bit of a dead zone so that it doesn't immediately go to movement when you touch the stick, you can set that up as well. Either way, I really appreciate the fact that you can customize the analog sticks however you'd like. Additionally, you can invert the axes on both X and Y for either of the sticks. This will come in handy if you're going to use button mapping software in Android to emulate touchscreen controls. Additionally, you can do the same setup with the analog triggers as well, so you can have them have a hair trigger kind of input, or you could give them a bit of a dead zone as well. And if you really wanted to get into the weeds, you could do some macro functions. Or if you wanted to practice your Chinese, you can change the language over as well. Anyway, in a nutshell, that's what you can expect to do on the Ultimate software. So now that we have our controller all set up, let's go ahead and start some gaming. We'll start with an Android phone, obviously, because I have that right in front of me, and we'll do a little bit of PS2 emulation. So here we're playing Madden 2005, and the controls work just great. Now these controllers have a Bluetooth 4.0 connectivity, so not the highest model in the world, but I didn't detect any input delay myself. However, if you're super sensitive to input delay with a Bluetooth controller, that might be something to consider. For now, let's move on to a different platform. Let's do a Nintendo Switch next. This is also super easy to pair, you just do it in the controller pairing options. And much like with the Android setup, the controls here feel nice and responsive. So I would say if you're looking for an alternative third-party controller for your Nintendo Switch, and maybe you prefer the Super Nintendo or PlayStation style setup, this might be a good fit. One other thing to mention here is that out of the box, this does have gyro control support. So for Breath of the Wild, all I had to do was go into the game settings, make sure it was enabled, and then when I pull the trigger, I have full gyro controls. Now I'm not an expert in gyro controls, I rarely use them, but these do feel nice and responsive. Okay, moving on to another platform here, we'll use the Anbernic Win600, which is a Windows-based PC, but I'm going to run Batocera, which is a Linux-based operating system. And within the menu here, it was super easy to pair this using the X input mode. And just like with the others here, no issues when it comes to input delay. This feels really great. So if you have a setup with a Linux-based operating system like emulation or Batocera, these controllers should work just fine. And if for some reason it doesn't work in the X input mode, I would recommend trying the D input mode instead. Now, one of the reasons I started with Batocera on this device over Windows is because I wanted to try it with retro gaming controls. And so here I'm playing Super Nintendo, and I gotta say it's a really great fit for this style of gameplay. Initially, it is a little bit odd to have like full grips while you're playing a retro game, but honestly, it's a very comfortable setup, and I love the fact that the D-pad is front and center here. So yeah, I think when it comes to a controller for retro emulation, this is gonna be a great $50 choice. Now, Batocera and emulation are not the only Linux gaming distros around. For example, SteamOS is also Linux-based. And this one, with an X input as well, also paired beautifully. Essentially, the Steam Deck thinks this is an Xbox controller when I have it plugged up, so everything works great. And the A, B, and XY button layout corresponds to how they are on the Steam Deck too, so it's a very seamless transition. So again, if you're looking for a third-party controller and you want something a little bit more D-pad centric for the Steam Deck, this is going to be a good fit. And finally, let's do a look at some Windows PC gaming. We're going to use the Aya Neo Air as our example, and this works really good with Bluetooth, but I also wanted to test the wired connection. And yeah, same thing here, nice and responsive. In fact, the difference between the Bluetooth connection and wired connection, I honestly couldn't tell. So really, these controllers work well with all of these different use cases. In fact, the only two ways these won't work are with PlayStation and Xbox consoles. Now, 8BitDo does sell a controller that does have Xbox support and has the same layout and everything. And I made a whole video about that controller as well, I'll leave it linked in the video description. Now, unfortunately, in order to play PlayStation 4 or PlayStation 5, you are going to have to use an adapter. So definitely something to think about if you want to use the Pro 2 on those specific consoles. And finally, here's a look at the original Pro 2 that I bought about a year and a half ago at this point. And like I mentioned, you know, exact same design layout and everything else. This one has a two-tone color scheme as well as labels directly on the buttons. And this one's still working great a year and a half later. We use it with our Nvidia Shield TV most of the time. And so yeah, I would say if you are looking for a nice third-party controller that will work on most different consoles, this is a great $50 solution. In particular, if you're planning on using it for retro game emulation, I think this is a great fit. And also, if you prefer that PlayStation-style controller setup, this will be a pretty good fit too. However, if you want a control setup that's more skewed towards analog sticks, then you may want to look elsewhere. 8BitDo does have a controller with this setup, but it's a wired controller and it only works with the Xbox as well as a personal computer. Either way, I don't think you can go wrong with any of these controllers here, and I do like these new color schemes as well. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are these your favorite third-party controllers, or there's something else you prefer? I change my mind about these things all the time, but these are still pretty awesome. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.